Let me tell you what that official document truly revealed. On May 14, 2026, the United States and China, two major powers that have been engaged in a fierce trade conflict for the past 3 years, one that completely rearranged the worldwide economic landscape, came together in Beijing. In that meeting, they reached consensus on two important issues at the same time. The first point: Iran must never be allowed to develop a nuclear weapon. The second: the Strait of Hormuz has to stay open for traffic. Take a second to absorb that. China buys more than 80% of the oil that Iran sends abroad. 80%. This goes way beyond a simple business relationship. It is a vital connection. And that very connection has now joined with Washington in a public declaration that strikes right at the heart of Tehran's most important strategic advantage. Here is why this development should matter to you personally, not just as some distant international news item, but as something that could show up in your monthly bills and daily expenses. The Strait of Hormuz handles about 20% of the planet's entire oil and natural gas movements each day. Any interruption in that passage immediately affects energy prices, the cost of shipping food and goods, and eventually even the interest rates that banks apply to loans in the coming months. Having followed energy politics and global strategy for more than 10 years now, I can say I have not witnessed a setup quite like this one. Stick with me here, because the obvious interpretation of yesterday's discussions is not the most concerning part. The real risks lie deeper below the surface, so here is precisely what we will explore together in the coming minutes. We will skip simply reading the official press statements. We will avoid echoing the same details that CNN or the South China Morning Post have already shared with you today. Instead, our focus will be on peeling back the polished diplomatic wording, sentence by sentence, to examine the hard facts and numbers that lie underneath. This approach is what truly distinguishes thoughtful strategic examination from ordinary news recaps. For instance, when an official joint announcement talks about parties having expressed interest rather than being committed to something, it is far from just a wording preference. It represents a significant legal and political difference that completely alters how we should interpret the current situation. This summit really breaks down into 3 distinct layers. The first layer involves what Beijing officially signed on to, and, crucially, what it chose to omit from the final agreement. The space between those two elements is where the most revealing aspects of the story can be found. The second layer concerns the current economic setup that has left Iran in a uniquely weak position compared to the past, and why that weakness does not necessarily mean Tehran will simply back down. The third layer addresses why keeping the Strait of Hormuz secure cannot be fixed merely by words spoken during a meeting in Beijing. Physical geography does not bend to negotiations. Shipping routes do not change because of press conferences. I plan to provide you with a solid framework for interpreting all the upcoming developments from this area over the following 30 to 90 days. But first, there is one key statistic that nearly all commentators discussing yesterday's gathering seem to have overlooked. And paying attention to this number completely changes our understanding of the bigger context. That number is 80%. Not the 12% figure that many reports highlight when talking about how much China relies on oil from Iran. According to detailed tanker tracking information from KPLR, cross-checked with research from Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, and independently reported by outlets including Reuters, the South China Morning Post, and The Diplomat, this 80% represents the portion of Iran's overall oil exports that ends up in Chinese facilities. When you combine these two percentages, the entire dynamic looks very different. China is not simply one of Iran's bigger clients for petroleum. In practical terms, China stands as the primary buyer that counts the most. Take China out of the picture, and Tehran would lose its main source of energy income. Now, let's construct the complete view using reliable information, step by step. Begin with the official summary released by the White House on May 14, 2026. The document declares, and I am pulling the exact wording from the public version, that both parties concurred the Strait of Hormuz needs to stay accessible to ensure uninterrupted energy transportation. It goes on to note that President Xi emphasized China's stance against turning the strait into a militarized zone or attempting to impose any kind of fees for passage. These details are straight from the source, not someone's spin. However, pay close attention to the following section, as it is one that most observers seem to have passed over. The readout mentions that China has shown interest in buying additional oil from the United States as a way to lessen its reliance on the strait going forward. Notice it says, expressed interest, not committed, not pledged, and certainly not finalized an agreement. In the world of diplomacy, that particular wording holds about as much formal obligation as a casual remark made over a meal. We will come back to why this subtle choice is so significant. Shifting now to the broader energy landscape. China's daily crude oil imports reached an all-time peak of 11.6 million barrels in 2025. This comes straight from China's General Administration of Customs and was verified in a January 2026 analysis by Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. Of that overall volume, the most trustworthy independent assessments from KPLR's vessel monitoring, especially important since Beijing ceased public reporting on specific Iranian shipments back in 2022, indicate that roughly 1.38 million barrels per day came from Iran during 2025. This accounts for around 12% of China's total crude supplies, coming from one heavily sanctioned origin and often routed through complex ship-to-ship transfers before being rebranded as coming from places like Malaysia or Indonesia upon arrival in Chinese harbors. Researchers from Colombia have directly validated this process. Their findings revealed that China appeared to receive more Malaysian crude than Malaysia itself could possibly produce. The equations only balance if a large share of those shipments actually started elsewhere, and that elsewhere is Iran. Next, consider China's strategic reserves. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration's April 2026 assessment of strategic stockpiles, China's government and commercial oil reserves together totaled close to 1.4 billion barrels by the end of December 2025. Based on recent usage levels, this stockpile provides approximately 4 months of full import needs without requiring any extra deliveries from Iran. That gives Beijing a solid buffer of 4 months to operate independently if necessary. Then there is the security situation developing on the ground. In the 48 hours immediately preceding the Beijing talks, specifically between May 12 and 13, 2026, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps wrapped up a 5-day training operation called the Martyrs Commander Drill. It took place in various command areas near Tehran. Reports from Euronews, the Institute for the Study of War, and Islam Times confirmed the activity. The Institute for the Study of War suggested the drills might have had 2 goals: showing their forces were prepared while also moving naval resources into better positions should the existing truce break down. Think about these 2 occurrences happening so close together. Beijing finalizing a shared understanding with Washington, while Tehran carries out a major military drill near its capital. These are not conflicting signals. They reveal where each player thinks the situation is going. But there is something the public records leave out, something few experts have tackled head-on. Given that China possesses such strong influence over Iran's economy and has now backed Washington's main concerns, why did Beijing also make it clear that it plans to continue purchasing oil from Iran? This is no accident or mixed message. It represents a deliberate approach. Grasping this strategy makes the difference between viewing the summit as a major shift versus seeing it as the first step in a much more intricate plan. The phrase that stood out to me right away when reviewing the White House summary was expressed interest. Shortly after the meeting wrapped up, Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke on NBC News. His comments were telling. They did not request anything specific from China. The U.S. was not seeking Beijing's assistance and did not require it. Putting that remark together with the official document creates a fascinating analytical situation. You have two nations both declaring success from identical talks. The American side portrays it as China coming around to support U.S. positions. Meanwhile, China's own summary of the event made no specific reference to Iran whatsoever. When the participants in the same discussion offered differing accounts, the differences between those accounts often point to the true areas of bargaining. According to the documented evidence, here is what Beijing explicitly endorsed: opposition to militarizing the Strait of Hormuz, rejection of any attempts to levy charges on vessels passing through, and agreement that Iran should not acquire nuclear arms. These elements appear in the White House release. What is noticeably absent? There is no promise from China to cut back on buying Iranian oil. No schedule for moving away from those supplies. No outlined ways for China to help enforce anything. No plan for Beijing to apply diplomatic influence on Tehran. In fact, President Trump stated publicly in comments to Fox News that Xi indicated China would continue purchasing significant amounts of Iranian oil. He noted they buy quite a bit from there and prefer to maintain that flow. A helpful way to understand this draws from a consistent pattern in China's handling of sanction-related matters over the last 10 years or so. Recall the time between 2015 and 2018 involving sanctions on North Korea. China often voiced support for the goals Washington outlined, such as denuclearization, maintaining stability, and ensuring security in the area, all while preserving the trade and energy ties that kept the North Korean economy functioning. The public statements of harmony existed alongside the practical networks of dependence, running side by side without ever fully merging. Experts from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace referred to this approach back then as constructive ambiguity. It was a balanced stance meant to keep as many choices open as possible while avoiding a complete break with either party. The events in Beijing on May 14, 2026, show signs of a comparable pattern. The real issue is not simply whether China has changed course, but the actual depth of any such change beyond the wording of the joint statement. Now we need to examine the Iranian perspective with the same careful attention, since this tends to be where many observers in the West go astray in their conclusions. The economic weakness is genuine. Iran directs roughly 90% of its oil export sales toward Chinese purchasers. These deals mostly involve smaller, independent processing plants located mainly in Shandong province, facilities known in the sector as teapot refineries. They work with slim profit margins and are generally steered clear of by China's largest state energy firms due to the risks tied to sanctions. Iran offers its oil at substantial discounts compared to global standards, often $5 to $15 less per barrel than Brent crude, since it lacks other major buyers who can step in at that volume. Should Beijing scale back its imports, even modestly or unofficially, Tehran's funds available for supporting its armed forces and government functions would shrink more rapidly than outside military actions might accomplish. The leverage exists, and the figures back it up solidly. Yet the common mistake in analysis leads to flawed forecasts. Having economic pressure does not guarantee that political leaders will yield on key issues. Tehran's recent public statements over the last few days make this crystal clear. On May 13, 2026, just before the summit, Iran's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei made it plain that stopping the conflict and removing the naval restrictions around the Strait of Hormuz must happen first, as conditions before any talks on nuclear matters can begin, not as results from bargaining, but as starting requirements. This is about setting the order of steps, not making an initial offer. Tehran is not proposing to trade away its advantages for some relief. It insists that relief has to precede sitting down at the table. At the same time, Iran submitted an official grievance to the Permanent Court of Arbitration against the United States, looking for payment related to losses from the fighting that started back in February 2026. taking a case to an international legal body, is not how a leadership on the brink of surrender behaves. It suggests a government preparing for extended challenges by creating an official paper trail. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Guard held its recent training exercise not focused directly on the strait, but in zones around the capital city. The Institute for the Study of War viewed this as possibly aimed at internal adjustments and boosting preparedness more than sending messages outward. Putting these three elements side by side, the demand for prior conditions, the legal filing at the tribunal, and the domestic-oriented military drills, paints a scene quite unlike what most news stories suggested yesterday. We are not looking at a regime ready to fold. Instead, it appears to be one strengthening its position at home as challenges mount from outside. There is another angle to this story that I have yet to find discussed much in the prominent reports about the summit, so I will lay it out carefully. This remains a reasoned possibility based on the practical needs of both the U.S. and China, rather than established certainty. Think about whether the understanding reached in Beijing is actually intended not to destroy Iran's position entirely. Perhaps it aims instead to keep things under control, setting upper limits on how far tensions can rise. This would benefit the interests of both Washington and Beijing, without forcing either to deal with the fallout from a completely failed Iranian state. The United States has little desire for a broken Iran, which would leave a dangerous empty space in the region that could prove far tougher to handle than one that is under strain yet still operating. Similarly, China has no interest in an Iran so unstable that it stops providing discounted oil on a steady basis. In this view, both sides share a goal of keeping Iran limited in its actions but intact, pushed toward future talks without being taken apart. Should this perspective hold true, the recent summit was less a decisive turning point, and more about putting in place a shared system for applying controlled pressure. It sends a clear but measured message to Tehran about new boundaries for what is tolerable, conveyed via high-level diplomacy. Remember that the Strait of Hormuz presents challenges that no agreement in a conference room can simply erase. At its narrowest, it spans just 21 nautical miles, with actual deep-water paths for large tankers, covering only about 2 nautical miles on either side. Over the past 40 years, this area has been gradually equipped with various unconventional tools: swift small boats, land-launched missiles, and drone aircraft. These are not built for winning traditional sea battles, but for driving up the expenses of passage, to the point where it no longer makes economic sense. A written declaration cannot modify the physical layout of the waters. What it can do is change how every involved country weighs the political risks and benefits. And that adjustment, subtle, deliberate, wrapped in the measured terms of interest, instead of firm promises, could emerge as either the key breakthrough in handling this situation, or perhaps Beijing's most refined use of strategic vagueness in years. The available information does not let us decide yet between those options, but it does highlight the specific indicators we should monitor moving forward. Allow me to connect all this high-level strategy back to matters closer to home. Whenever I discuss events of this nature, whether summits, shared declarations, or adjustments in how big countries position themselves, viewers often reach out with a similar thought. It sounds significant, but how does it affect my everyday reality? That is actually a very smart inquiry, and it calls for a straightforward, detailed response. So let's trace the connections one by one, from the discussions held in Beijing yesterday straight through to impacts on your household budget right now. The Strait of Hormuz is responsible for moving around 20% of global oil and gas volumes daily, not just for one area, but for the whole world. Each shipment of petroleum, liquefied natural gas, or related chemicals traveling through there comes with an added risk cost built into its price. This extra charge comes from what insurers, transport firms, and traders calculate as the chance of problems occurring on any particular day. That risk factor did not vanish following yesterday's announcement. The truce between Iran and the United States continues to be shaky. Recent evaluations from the Institute for the Study of War indicate Iranian units are shifting equipment in patterns that suggest they are gearing up for possible renewed activity should the pause end. Naval restrictions on Iranian harbors are still enforced, and Iranian leaders keep calling them violations of global rules. For as long as this uncertainty lingers, the costs of transporting energy in that zone stay higher than normal. And those increased shipping expenses do not remain confined to the maritime sector. They spread outward. They show up in the price refineries pay for raw crude. They influence the bulk rates for gasoline and diesel. Ultimately, they reach the prices you see at fuel stations everywhere. Rising fuel expenses are far from theoretical. They function like an added charge on every mile of truck transport, every delivery of groceries to stores, and every air shipment moving products over long distances. The International Monetary Fund, in its 2026 World Economic Outlook, estimated that if tensions drag on with persistently high oil costs and wavering inflation outlooks, worldwide economic expansion might slow to 2.5%. While that might not qualify as a full recession according to strict measures, it would still create ongoing pressure on what families can afford to buy in any country, tied into international energy flows, meaning pretty much everywhere. One aspect that mainstream business reporting tends to overlook, yet which could deliver the biggest practical blow in the months ahead, involves how this affects production costs. China brings in over 55% of its crude oil from Middle Eastern sources, and nearly all of it passes through the Strait of Hormuz. If China's expenses for energy climb, due to higher coverage costs, detours around risky areas, or having to source replacements for Iranian volumes from costlier suppliers, then the price of everything China manufactures goes up too. Those finished Chinese products feed into supply networks throughout Southeast Asia, South Asia, and consumer markets around the globe. Any rise in production expenses at the beginning does not stop in China. It passes along the line to every buyer, wholesaler, and store that handles the items until they reach shoppers. For companies running with limited profit margins, which includes most small and mid-sized operations in these areas, such increases in expenses, coming at the same time as reduced customer spending, can be especially tough. Input prices go higher on one side while buying power shrinks on the other. The difference is what decides whether those businesses stay afloat. This explains my point about the Strait of Hormuz acting as a sensitive spot that touches regular economic activities. It does not make big headlines every time. It does not hit like one sudden crisis. Rather, it builds up slowly, wearing away at the calculations that shape routine choices. There is yet another connection that seldom links back to gatherings like the one in Beijing, but it could matter a great deal to anyone managing loans or considering big money moves in the coming year or so. For the last couple of years, central banks in leading nations have worked to create conditions for bringing down borrowing rates. Success in that effort relies heavily on keeping public views about future inflation steady. Tensions arising from geopolitics in energy markets rank among the surest ways to upset those expectations, since energy prices feed straight into overall inflation numbers reported each month. And those headline figures heavily influence the choices central banks make. Each additional month where the situation around the strait stays unsettled adds another element of doubt to inflation forecasts. This does not make rate cuts impossible, but it does make them more difficult to justify. Keeping rates elevated for an extended time translates to sustained higher expenses for home loans, increased costs for companies to borrow, and raised standards for deciding on new investments. The choices reached in that Beijing meeting will not show up directly on your next bank notice. Yet they are already flowing through the wider economic web in gradual, fundamental ways. The typical manner in which influences travel across linked systems until they suddenly become noticeable. And the key unknown that no official statement has settled is how long this buildup of pressure will last. So this is our current position as of May 15, 2026. Beijing has put its views on record. The White House summary documents it clearly. President Xi voiced disapproval of militarizing the Strait of Hormuz and concurred that Iran cannot possess nuclear capability. Those statements are now part of the formal account. Nevertheless, the Revolutionary Guard finished its 5-day training drills around Tehran during this period. Iran has pursued legal recourse internationally against the United States for conflict-related costs. Tehran's diplomats have declared that ending the blockade must precede any discussions. Reports also mention a vessel being taken near the strait and directed toward Iranian territory on the very day the summit ended. The truce holds but remains unsteady. The physical features of the waterway have stayed exactly the same. These opposing facts coexist in the present. They do not cancel each other out. They define the true nature of the ongoing tensions. Anyone promising a simple, straightforward resolution in either direction is offering a story rather than a balanced assessment. Here is the uncertainty I must acknowledge openly with you. Should China's stance indicate a real adjustment in its approach to the Persian Gulf, the strain on Tehran in the weeks and months ahead could exceed anything seen since the heavy sanctions period around 2012. On the other hand, if it amounts to a well-crafted example of deliberate vagueness, with matching words but unchanged business dealings, then we could be looking at an extended phase of controlled friction in the Strait of Hormuz. This scenario would primarily aid those who gain from ongoing unpredictability. At this stage, it remains impossible to know for certain which interpretation will turn out accurate. No one can say yet. However, the pieces of evidence that will clarify things are already starting to appear. They will stand out clearly to those paying attention to the right details. That is the kind of examination I will continue to provide here at World Horizon View. We go beyond surface-level reports to explore the underlying frameworks. If this level of detailed insight proves valuable for you, consider subscribing or following along. The following steps in this developing story are unlikely to come with fanfare. They will reveal themselves through the statistics, the movements on the ground, and the differences between official statements and what the actual evidence demonstrates. Those differences are exactly what this channel focuses on uncovering.